Yeah, this has been really good so far. I really enjoyed hearing Gordon talk about living creatures and how we think about them in the past related to questions with the fall and the curse as well as the initial creation. And so I want to kind of take us a little bit farther along that trail and think about Noah's flood. And so what we talked about, if you remember last night, and maybe some of you weren't there, or maybe you just forgot or you were asleep when I was talking, we talked about fossils, right? And we wanted to know, how do fossils fit in with Earth history? How do we think through that based on what the Bible tells us? And we talked about the rock layers and the fossil record, the geologic column, and how many creationists, geologists, have been working on this, and it seems like most of us agree that it's represented as we have there, that the pre-flood is the Precambrian is mainly pre-flood, the Paleozoic and Mesozoic are from the flood, and the Cenozoic is mainly post-flood. And so that's great, that's interesting. We were learning a lot there. We're seeing the connections and being able to think through how the Bible guides our understanding and what we view as we look at nature. But I want to talk about a different goal now, kind of flip this thing on its head, okay? What can fossils tell us about Noah's flood and its aftermath? Okay, now we want to be really careful here. I'm not saying, how can we reinterpret the Bible in light of science? That's not what I'm saying, okay? The Bible is the foundation, okay? Scripture is the revealed word of God, okay? It has authority. What I am saying, though, is that Scripture doesn't give us all the details, right? I mean, there's 4 chapters, I guess, if you count the end of the flood, in Genesis that talk about the flood. That's not a ton of information. It's the information we need, biblically. It's what we need for our spiritual life and for our knowledge of God. Scriptures are sufficient, but they're not giving us a bunch of scientific details that we'd want to know, right? Like, for instance, okay, we find fossils of dinosaurs and other extinct creatures in sediments laid down by Noah's flood, we think, as I just told you. Okay, so here's a big Dicynodonts pleurosaurus. It's not a dinosaur, but it's a cool animal anyway. It's big enough for you to ride it. That's the definition of a cool animal, right? And so this creature, we find fossils of it, we think, in layers laid down by Noah's flood. Well, this would have been an air-breathing creature. So what happened to these creatures after the flood? Some of them, we would think, would have to have gone on Noah's Ark, right? They're air-breathing creatures. They must have been there. And in fact, if you go to the Ark Encounter that's run by Answers in Genesis in Kentucky, they do have some pleurosaurus on the Ark, which is cool. You can see some life-size models of them. And they're fun creatures. They're really interesting. So we got to think about, okay, these things are on the ark. That's something the Bible doesn't tell us, that pleurosaurus are on the ark, right? We're inferring that from thinking through scientifically. But then we got the question of, well, what happened to these things after the flood? Because there aren't pleurosaurus wandering around today, as far as I can tell, right? Haven't seen them. I've been a few places in the world. Haven't run into any yet. So what happened to them? And in fact, why isn't our world today just full of giant reptiles? When you look at the fossil record, they're everywhere, right? There's tons of dinosaurs and tons of synapsids like these and tons of other creatures. And today, they're just not around. So I'm going to lead us in that direction. Okay, we're going to start trying to answer those questions. But first, I want to take you on a journey back in time, not back to the flood, but back to the 1500s and 1700s. Okay, so nowhere near back to the flood, but in the past. I want to take you back to the days of what we call the Age of Exploration. Okay, when Western Europe, they were sending out people in ships and exploring the New World, what they called the New World, right? The Americas, and exploring Australia and other places as well. And one of the really surprising things about, we'll talk about the Americas in particular, were all the animals that they had never seen before. Okay, and so people visited there and they took notes and they talked to native peoples out there and they made drawings and they tried to explain to people back in Europe what they were seeing. And they did this with variable levels of success. Okay, so for instance, we have this creature right here. This is from a drawing in 1557. Anyone want to take a guess what this is? North American creature? This is an armadillo, yeah. So they did a pretty good job with that one. Like, okay, I can see that. I mean, the bands don't keep going on the face, you know what I mean? But like, yeah, okay, that's kind of like an armadillo, fair enough. You know, there are no armadillos in Europe or Asia or Africa. They're just not there, okay? How about this guy? What is that? That's a sloth. Obviously a sloth, okay. No, that's a sloth. The original description of a sloth that got back to Europe was it was a little bear with the face of a baby, which I don't exactly see that, but I mean, yeah, okay, sure. You're trying, okay. Nothing can prepare you for this one. What is that? I'm pretty sure you would have heard of these before. That's a possum. That's a Virginia possum, okay? What on earth? I don't know, okay? So there's a few things going on here. I mean, they do have the babies on the back. That's a good start, right? Beyond that, it's kind of just chaos, right? I mean, the tail, my guess is they got it confused maybe with some South American marsupial species. I don't know, but that is supposed to be a possum. So some imaginative illustration there. You had a lot of this telephone game going on, right, when they're constructing these. So anyway, they're discovering these creatures. And this starts to raise some really interesting questions for scientists, or what we might call natural philosophers in that day, back in Europe. They're starting to wonder, how did these animals get here? Why aren't they in Europe or Asia or Africa? Because they felt like they had a pretty good handle on what the animals were that were out there. And now they're finding these and then not even stepping into Australia, right? Because there's all kinds of very peculiar things there. And so one of the guys who was very interested in this was Linnaeus. Linnaeus we think of as the father of modern biology in many ways, of taxonomy certainly. The idea of giving animals genus and species names. This is coming from Linnaeus, okay? These Latin and Greek names. And so Linnaeus was interested in this topic we call biogeography. Why do we find creatures on the earth where we find them? And so Linnaeus is thinking about the earth. And for Linnaeus, it is explaining Europe and Asia and Africa is not really that big of a deal. Sorry, my computer was getting unplugged and it kept the screen kept changing. So yeah, imagine animals leaving Ararat, right? The ark lands, the animals spread out after the flood. Not much of a problem, right? It's kind of a problem for thinking about the Americas or Australia. But Linnaeus actually thinks of another problem beyond these faraway places. A problem just for Europe and Asia and Africa. And the problem goes like this. I'm going to use, for an example, a polar bear, okay? Polar bears are alive today. They're around. He knows about them. They live in the Arctic, where it's cold, and they have white fur that blends in. You guys are familiar with. Actually, it's technically not white, but I'm not going to get into that. Okay, they blend in with their surrounding. Polar bears are designed to live in cold polar climates. Okay, so how then do you have a polar bear survive on a boat in the Middle East? Okay, this is the problem Linnaeus is wrestling through in his mind. And so Linnaeus comes up with a solution. He says, well, it's not that the animals were preserved on the ark. The animals were preserved on Mount Ararat. And so how this works is, if you think about latitude, okay, if you go too far north or too far south, it gets really, really cold, right? And you regret it, okay? But if you come back this way, it gets really warm at the equator, okay? Same thing with a mountain. If you climb up a mountain, it's really cold at the top. It snows, right? You can have mountains in tropical countries where there's snow on top. And you have these different climates as you go down the mountain. So Linnaeus says, well, there you go. That, the animals from tropical areas lived at the bottom of the mountain and animals from the polar regions lived at the top of the mountain. And that's how they could all survive Noah's flood. And not only that, he was convinced that it was also the Garden of Eden. He was convinced that the Garden of Eden was also like this, that you would have the polar climate at the top and then temperate and then tropical, and then those animals could have spread out from there 2 times, okay? Now, there's some problems here, right? I mean, there's a really big problem scripturally. The Bible does not say this. The Bible says that God preserved the animals on the ark, right? God says in the Bible that the flood covered the highest mountains. There were not mountains exposed. So this really is an issue. But it's also got some scientific flaws to it. And there was another scientist in the 1700s, Comte de Buffon, we call him, and he was not really a friend of the Bible, okay? He didn't really take that into account when he was doing his science. He would never outright say he was an atheist. It was kind of an unpopular thing to do, but he definitely leaned that way. And Buffon says, okay, we've got a problem, Linnaeus. No, I don't know if he's actually talking to him, but let's think about a polar bear again. Okay, that's great. They had the polar bear on the mountain and he can be happy and everything. But he's got to come down from the mountain, right? And to walk from the top of the mountain, he's got to go down the mountain, and then he's got to go through the Middle East and through the Russian steppe before he finally gets to an Arctic region that he's used to, the poles. How's a polar bear going to do that, Linnaeus? I mean, he's got to go from the Arctic through these hotter climates, climb up a mountain to be preserved, and then when the flood is done, he has to come down the mountain, back through the hot climates, and back up north. And that's a problem. I don't see a polar bear doing that, is Buffon's point. And Buffon had his own thoughts about how exactly biogeography worked. He thought that there were different centers of origin for different animals in the northern hemisphere, and they spread south. And no one thinks that anymore, but that's what he thought. And one thing that Buffon noticed, a really interesting thing, is that different parts of the Earth with the same climate have different animals and plants. So just for example, let's talk about, here's South America and Africa, okay? Both of these have different areas that are comparable climate-wise, right? So they've got grasslands, they've got tropical forests, they've got all kinds of things like that. And so if we look at the grassland environment, okay, and if you look for animals that are eating bugs, termites, ants, those kinds of things, you have an anteater in South America, right? Anteaters only live in the Americas. They are not found elsewhere, which really annoyed me about Lion King. They got the sequence where Simba is singing, like, I just can't wait to be king, and all the animals pile on top of each other, and there's anteaters there. And I'm like, what on earth? Why did you do that? Why did you put them there? Because Africa already has their own anteaters. They have aardvarks, and they also have pangolins. Like, you could have picked either one of those, and you would have been fine, but they picked a South American anteater. I don't know what Disney was thinking back in there. I don't know what Disney's thinking today, but it's an unusual choice, okay? But the point is, you have these animals that are filling the same role and different continents in the same environments, and they're different types of animals. They're not close relatives of each other at all. And so, as I said, Buffon's point against Linnaeus's idea is that species would have to cross inhospitable terrains to get to their modern ecosystems after the flood. And he says that's just not believable. So as we think through this, right, I want to point out to you the issues that are here with what Linnaeus said. Linnaeus was willing to give up details of the biblical narrative because of his belief in species fixity. Let me explain what I mean. Species fixity is the idea that God made every single species or variety of creature that exists today or ever, he made them exactly as they were during the creation week, okay, exactly as they looked. And Linnaeus at that time was thinking that, okay? And so because he thought, well, a polar bear must live in the Arctic climate, polar bears must have been created by God exactly to live in Arctic climates, therefore, we've got this problem where I've got to institute, Mount Ararat surviving the flood and change the biblical text. And of course, the ironic part of this whole thing is that actually later in Linnaeus's life, he abandoned species fixity and was thinking maybe the genus or maybe even the family was the level of the created kind. But this idea of species fixity is found throughout creationism and people's thinking on creationism. So here's a quote from a book called The First Fossil Hunters. It's by a historian named Adrian Meyer. It's a really good book, by the way. She's not a creationist, but it is really interesting just about how ancient people understood fossils. But there's this quote I found in the book. From the Middle Ages until Darwin, science was dominated by the biblical doctrine of creationism, which holds, here it is, that the world species were created all at once by God and have never changed or gone extinct. Okay, this is what she says. This is what the biblical doctrine of creationism teaches. Okay, it still finds its adherents modern, and I love all the quotes coming in, Creation scientists hold that only an intelligent design can plausibly explain the complexity of Earth's origin in biology, and that evolution itself is a new creation myth devised by the scientific elite. So very clear position on this. Okay, not a big fan of creationists. But I have this question reading this: does the Bible actually teach these things that she says the Bible teaches? Because she doesn't just say creationists believe these things. She says it's the biblical doctrine of creation. Right? So we got to go back and see, what does the Bible actually teach on this? So when we think about biblical creationism, we go back to the text, we have some very clear statements, right? For instance, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, rested on the seventh. You can see this Genesis 1, you can see this Exodus 20:11 in the Ten Commandments. God created different kinds of animals and plants. That's very clear on different days in the creation week. For instance, on day 3, he made plants with seeds and fruit trees. On day 5, he made sea creatures. It talks about great sea creatures, or there's different translations there, or birds. And day 6, it talks about livestock, crawling things or creeping things, and animals of the earth. And then, of course, there's also humans. It's very clear that these can't all have a single origin, right? He made different types of animals and different types of plants. But some things to note here. These descriptions are not species, okay? It doesn't tell us what exactly they are, other than it's very vague, right? Creatures of the earth. That's about as vague as you can get, okay? The idea is Moses is not trying to give us, a taxonomic rundown, right? He's not trying to help us understand science. He's just saying, hey, God made some stuff. He made some of this stuff and some of that stuff. That's where he's talking about. And so there's no reason automatically to assume that what we call scientifically a species today is the same thing as the kinds God made. Now, the word species means lots of things to different people, okay? And actually to scientists it means different things too. But in the technical term of species, I've got 3 species on the screen there. I've got Canis lupus, which is the wolf. I've got Canis latrans, the coyote, and I've technically got a Canis familiaris up there, okay? Although it's hard to tell in some dog breeds, in this one in particular. All of those are considered different species by many experts, and yet they freely interbreed with each other, even in the wild, right? So I have no problem believing that dogs and wolves and coyotes share a common ancestor that hopped off Noah's Ark. I mean, I don't have a problem with that at all. And so if we're going to be really rigid with this and say, no, each one of these has to be its own created kind, that doesn't really make any sense. And the next thing is, there's nothing in the text that tells us about whether these kinds can change. It says that they'll reproduce after their kind, but it doesn't give us any kind of clue or limit into the variability of these. Can they have purple spots? Can they start, just like we were talking about actually in Dr. Wilson's talk just a little bit ago, that you have creatures that might have had things that essentially hidden that weren't expressed yet, and the outside of the animal or visibly that were hidden during the creation week, right? That's massive change. That wasn't there originally. Well, it was hidden inside, but it wasn't expressed yet. So where does this idea of species fixity come from then, if it doesn't directly come out of the Bible? Okay, I think first of all, it's just natural to assume, right? Like, I have ground squirrels in my backyard. I try and get rid of them. They keep coming back. I can't stop them. Every day when I get up, I see them. It's not like one day I'm going to come out and there's going to be like a 6-legged ground squirrel. Like that's, that doesn't happen, right? Our normal experience tells us that, ground squirrels give birth to ground squirrels, give birth to ground squirrels. Additionally, Plato and Aristotle were both species fixists for different reasons. And Aristotle's a little bit vague about this, but they do both seem to be species fixists. And definitely the way they were read in the Middle Ages, everyone saw them as saying, the species is a unit, it's a distinct unit, and it can't change. And during the Middle Ages, you had this constant problem of trying to work Aristotle with the church fathers and the Bible together, where you had some very unusual things happening there. And so the medieval scholars were heavily dependent on Aristotle. And then I will say too, I think we have a really terrible habit of uniformitarianism. Now I don't mean it in the geological sense, but I mean by analogy. We just tend to assume that the way things are today is the way they've always been. It's a bad habit we have. So I'll give you a classic example in my field. Here's a tuatara. He's going to love this, right? It's a reptile. They live in New Zealand. It's actually not, it looks like a lizard. It's not a lizard. It's a rhynchocephalian. They're otherwise extinct group. It's the only ones left. They're really cool animals. We can talk about them later. But the point is, they're a reptile. They're cold-blooded. All of our reptiles today are basically cold-blooded. Leatherback sea turtles are kind of funky with that, but everybody else is, hey, I'm a cold-blooded reptile. And so when we find fossil things that have similarities to reptiles, we automatically shoehorn them in there and say, oh, that's got to be basically a lazy, cold-blooded creature too, right? But when you look at the things that are actually in the fossil record, they're really, really different. I mean, you've got animals that are, 30, 50, 60, 100 feet long and are walking with an erect posture, legs directly beneath their bodies. Some of them are fast. Some of them are incredibly active animals. That's not like a tuatara. Or what about our marine reptiles? Some of them reaching 100 feet long in the ocean, some of them much shorter, but the same shape as a dolphin. And in fact, now we have fossils that show they had blubber and they gave birth to live young. We don't have any reptiles like that, right? What about our flying reptiles, our pterosaurs, that are covered in fuzz, feathery-like fuzz, and they have these wing membranes, and they're actively flapping animals? That's a pretty, energetic animal. We have nothing like that today. So when we automatically assume, oh, reptiles are cold-blooded, we're making a statement of what we see right now and trying to extrapolate outwards, and I don't think that's warranted. We need to be really careful thinking about the past, okay? And so if we're going to understand the past, right, we need to, remember, consult the Earth history that's laid out for us in Scripture, but we need to be willing to have our assumptions challenged, okay? So when we look at our biblical view of Earth history, I've shown you this many times, creation, fall and curse, flood, and Tower of Babel. I'm adding in some extra stuff here. I'm showing you some particular, you can think of them as like periods of time, right, where we might have different things. So for instance, between the creation week and the fall, we'd have a pre-fall world, where, as you just heard from Dr. Wilson, you got to hear about that there were creatures not eating each other, right, that there weren't dangerous parasites and diseases. That's really hard for us to imagine today, what that's like. That's a very different world than the world after the fall, but before the flood, which we could call the pre-flood world. And I'm going to suggest to you today that the pre-flood world is very different than the post-flood world. And in fact, we not only have scriptural support from that, we have scientific evidence that also corroborates that. Okay, so let me show you our scriptural support for this. And it's not in Genesis, it's in 2 Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter, so first of all, the whole book of 2 Peter, Peter is writing to his readers, telling them to watch out for false prophets and false teachers, right? And I mean, he talks about other things too, but that's a big emphasis that's in there. And when he gets to chapter 3, he's defending the return of Christ and the coming judgment. And he's saying, you can have confidence that these things are really going to happen. Jesus really will come back one day. There really will be a judgment. Because, as he says this right here, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue just as they were from the beginning of creation. So they're saying, look, really? You think some guy's going to come down out of the sky? You think God's going to come and judge the earth? Listen, you know what happens. You wake up in the morning, you eat breakfast, you go to work, you come back home, you wake up again the next morning. It's just over and over again, cycle after cycle. They're saying nothing miraculous happens. God doesn't step in and do things. And Peter says, hold on a minute. For ever since the fathers fell asleep, that's not what I'm going to say. For, here's what Peter says, when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed by being flooded with water. Do you see what I see? And don't say a star. I know what you're thinking. Okay. Peter implies that the world before the flood was destroyed. Okay? It's a completely new world, the way he talks about it, right? The world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. We have a new world. Peter's point is, look, you can be confident that God can judge the earth and can do the miraculous because he did it before, right? He did come in and create the world out of nothing. He did come in and flood the entire earth with a global catastrophic judgment. So God can certainly do those things again, and he applies this to the final judgment. And if you keep reading in 2 Peter, he specifically talks about how the final judgment will be by fire, not by water. But he says that God is going to create a new heavens and new earth, right? There's this parallel that's happening between you have creation and then you have the flood, right? You have this judgment that happens, and what happens? A new earth after that, okay? And then what are we going to have? A final judgment. What's going to happen? A new earth after that. Now, the earth after the flood is still affected by the curse. It's not a new earth in the sense of Revelation's new earth, but it's a different place. Even if you compare, I don't want to jump too much on Jeremy's shoes here, but even if you compare Genesis 1 and 2 with Genesis 8 and 9, you'll see all of these similarities, right? That the land appears and the water drained away. And you'll see how God tells the animals, spread all over the earth, right? Be fruitful and multiply. And he tells the people, be fruitful and multiply. He does it both times, at the original creation and after the flood. So let's think about that for a minute. The world before the flood was different. It was destroyed. Things were different then. That's something Steve Austin would always tell us in geology class. Things were different then. I have a colleague, not at Masters, a paleontologist guy I know. We worked together before. He's an evolutionist. He was a Christian. He's now a liberal Jew. But he's an evolutionist. He tries to convince me to adopt evolution, and we have these discussions. I try and convince him that Jesus is the Messiah. It's a good exchange. And one of the things he likes to try and challenge me with is frogs. Okay, so frogs are everywhere. I'm going to get Gordon to help me here. There are, I believe, I'm trying to remember the exact number now, named species of frogs. There are more named species of frogs than there are named species of mammals. Just frogs alone, there's more species we know of frogs, living species, than we do living mammals. That's crazy. I mean, that's what is going on there, right? Frogs are everywhere. I mean, they're not in polar regions, but you can find them in deserts. You can find them in temperate regions, especially tropical regions. Any kind of swampy kind of place, you're going to find frogs, right? You know how it goes. Okay, there's frogs all over the place there. And when you look at the fossil record, there's some spots that are incredibly swampy, right? So there's the Carboniferous layers where it's big swampy environments, that kind of classic thing a frog would love, okay? And yet there's no frogs anywhere. Instead, there's all of these other kinds of amphibians, like microsaurs, which may or may not be amphibians. It's a big taxonomic nightmare. But they're amphibian-like creatures. And you have all these other kinds of things. You have amphibians with boomerang-shaped heads. You have amphibians that are the size of buses. You have all kinds of crazy stuff going on, okay? And so he says, if frogs really did live at the same time of these creatures, right? If the Bible's true, like you're telling me, then these frogs should be everywhere. They should be all over the place, because look, that's where they are today. But we have to remember things were different then. We live in a post-disaster world. Our world is not the same world as before the flood. So our world today, you can imagine with me for a moment, the ark doors open, and it's go time, right? Set the stopwatch, sound off the gun, whatever it is, and animals go. And some animals are going to do really well, and some animals are not going to do very well. And frogs did really well. They were a very successful group. Today, there's only 3 basic types of amphibians, 3 body plans you find in amphibians. There's frogs, there's salamanders, and there's things called caecilians that you've probably never encountered, but they're like worm-like creatures. They're really interesting things. You look at the fossil record, there's dozens of types of amphibians. There's other unrelated ones that look like snakes or worms. You have ones with fins on their backs. You have ones that look like crocodiles. You have ones that possibly went into the ocean. You had all kinds of interesting stuff going on. And they're gone. So our world before the flood was very high in what we call disparity. There were lots of different types of creatures. Whereas our world today, it's lower in disparity, but it's higher in diversity. So yes, we don't have as many types of amphibians, but the types we do have many, many species in them. Okay? We're seeing a change there. So this helps us think through. I asked you at the beginning, why don't we have giant reptiles anymore, right, that are dominating the landscape? I think they didn't do well. I think they got off the ark, and in the next few generations, they just weren't coping. It's a post-disaster world. It would not have been an easy world for a 100-foot-long sauropod dinosaur. There's not trees everywhere, right? Any of the trees are tiny things. They're just starting to grow back. You don't have fully formed forests. It's going to be hard for that animal. If you're a giant carnivore that needs to eat really big meals, there might not be a lot to eat. And so what's going to do well? Animals that can eat little food, animals that can burrow around, animals that are small and have very fast reproduction are going to do really, really well. And so not everybody has an equal footing when they get off the ark. But what we do see is that after the flood, the world is starting over. It's like the creation event again. Okay, and you see all these parallels between Noah and Adam. I can't steal his thunder, okay? He's going to be talking about all that, okay? But you see it, and that helps us understand the problem with the polar bear, okay? How do we deal with Linnaeus and Buffon's discussions here on biogeography? Well, there's actually a very easy solution to this. Polar bears weren't on the ark. Their ancestors were. Polar bears are a variety of bear. We have lots of bears today. And in fact, polar bears can hybridize with other bears. And they do this in the wild. So grizzly bears and polar bears sometimes will encounter each other, and they will have offspring that we'll call either prizzly bears or growler bears, or there's a Inuit name for it. I can't remember what it is. They have different names for them. But yeah, it's a hybrid between the two. We have black bears, we have panda bears. There's all kinds of interesting bears. And pandas are really different than the other ones, but they're recognizable as bears. And so if we start using science and we look at the fossil record, we find out we can trace the history of bears and how they spread all over the earth, which is really cool. And we find that there are bear-like creatures that back in the fossil record that are probably the ancestors, the things that got off the ark. And this is the whole, when we get into the science of what we call Baminology, trying to figure out what is the created kind. I don't think it's the polar bear. I think it's a bigger group that contains polar bears. We might disagree about how big we think that group is, but the point is, yeah, God programmed the bear ancestor to be able to be a polar bear or be a black bear. That's the idea, is that this stuff was hidden within and it became expressed later as they interacted with environments and other creatures. So this really helps us understand this. We can see how there is biological change within boundaries that God has built into his creatures. Had Linnaeus been allowing for this much biological change, I don't think he would have struggled with this problem of the ark and biogeography after the flood. So let me give you a cool example of how paleontology has kind of helped us think through these things. South America is not an island today, but immediately after the flood, it looks like it was. It was not connected to any landmass. In fact, the closest landmass to South America immediately after the flood was probably Antarctica. Antarctica had no ice at that point. And we know that because we find fossils of plants and animals in Antarctica after the flood down there, which is cool to think about. And so it was an island. So how did animals get to South America then? Well, there's several ways. Flying animals can fly, swimming animals can swim, right? But what about your land animals? We have something called rafting, okay? This is going to sound silly at first, but hold with me, okay? Rafts of vegetation. So big chunks of logs and plants and all kinds of things can wash out to sea, and if you have any small animals on them, they ride it like a boat to wherever it goes. If it doesn't go anywhere, they die, which is really sad. But hopefully it goes somewhere, okay? And some people mock that and they say it's silly, but we've observed this happen. So there's been hurricanes that have come through the Caribbean, and big rafts of vegetation have washed out because of these storms, and iguanas have been carried from island to island in the Caribbean. So back in the 1990s, they observed this happening, that some iguanas, actually fishermen watched this thing show up on the shore, and then iguanas left it, and now they have an established population there. And the scientists were able to track it back and realize they had covered 200 kilometers, that this thing had washed out to sea and shown up somewhere else. It's really incredible stuff. And we have new volcanic islands that still appear today, and animals colonize them. They find their way out to them. It's really incredible. And so we can look at the fossil record and trace the first appearances of different creatures in South America after the flood. And we have what's called the first American biotic interchange. Animals come into South America, and these would have been immediately after the flood. Actually, the first animals we see in South America after the flood are reptiles. And we get some really big snakes like Titanoboa and some big crocodiles and turtles and stuff. But then mammals start showing up. We get marsupials. We have our native ungulates, things like a Strapitherium here. Look at that guy. What a guy. Gonzo nose on him. And we get xenarthrans. Those are our armadillos, sloths, and anteaters. They're never found anywhere else on the earth. They get really interesting. In fact, we have some armadillos that are as big as you and had clubbed tails with spikes on them. Yeah, you could ride that armadillo around. It's called a glyptodont. Then we have the transatlantic dispersal interval. Suddenly, in the South American fossil record, we start finding monkeys and rodents in South America. They're not there before, and then they just pop up, and they say, hello, I'm here. And it looks like they rafted over from Africa, because South America and Africa were still somewhat close at that point, and they got over. And then we have the famous one, which is called the Great American Biotic Interchange. And this is, in the history of the post-flood world, South America and North America finally connected. They clicked together at the Isthmus of Panama. And when that happened, a bunch of North American animals ran down to South America, and a bunch of South American animals ran up to North America. And that is why we have possums and armadillos in the United States today. They're South American creatures. We used to have sloths, too. We had big ground sloths, which were really cool. We find fossils of them in Los Angeles. People will dig for tunnels, or they'll be constructing buildings, and it's like, oops, here's another ground sloth, and they got to dig it out and everything. They used to be around there. And South America got lots of animals we think of as classically South American. They're not. Llamas, jaguars, these animals moved into South America. They were invaders after there were already animals out there. And so this is really, really cool stuff that we can think through a biblical perspective on. And what's really interesting about this in particular from a young earth creationist standpoint is that there's very few dispersals. If you're really imagining 50 or 60 million years of South America history, right, there should be tons of these things happening. I mean, there's got to be one at least every million years, you'd think, right, that would successfully make it over there. But in a very short time scale, yeah, we might imagine there's only a few that actually make it across the ocean, and that's what we see. And then we can start thinking about the fossil record of us, right? How does paleontology help us understand our history? So if you look at the geologic column, where do you find human fossils? Only at the very top. So one of the questions I get asked all the time is, why are human fossils only found at the very top of the fossil record? Well, once again, we got to think back to a biblical perspective, trying to match this up with the rocks and fossils, and we find that those are post-flood humans, after the flood. What that means is all our pre-flood humans are currently missing. So what did the flood, it obviously killed humans. Where are the remains? We don't know. There's various models out there. If you want to hear about them, I can tell you later. But we'll be completely honest, we don't know. So what we're looking at then in the Cenozoic is this post-flood timetable here between the flood and potentially Tower of Babel or later. But here's what's cool. This is where a creationist perspective really helps us out. Having this perspective helps us understand why humans show up when they do in the post-flood sediments. Because think about what happens when the ark lands, right? God tells them, be fruitful, multiply. The animals spread all over the earth. The people don't, right? The people basically congregate in the plain of Shinar, it talks about. Okay? And you have the Tower of Babel and that whole event. And then God forces the people to spread, right, through the confusion of their languages. So what we would predict as creationist paleontologists is that we should see animals spreading all over the earth before people do. Animals make it farther out to farther places before the humans make it out there. And that's exactly the record we see. And so that's really, really interesting and exciting. But what do we do with these fossils that look like they're transitional between apes and humans? What people call ape men. Well, this is, like I told you about, the science of Baminology, trying to figure out what are the boundaries to the created kind. And so one of the scientists who's done a lot of work on this is Todd Wood, and he's been applying Baminological methods to understand humans. And we have some time. I guess I can try and explain these charts. Basically, what you're looking at, let's start with the one on the right, with the little colored dots, okay? Each dot is a species, okay? And so Homo sapiens is one of these three dots right here. That's our species. The space there represents how similar or different they are. So if dots are close together, they're very similar things. If the dots are very far apart, they're very different things. And so what we predict as creationists, remember, is that there are distinct created kinds. Okay? So there is a humankind. That humankind has diversity, right? Not everyone in this room looks the same. Okay? The question is, how diverse are we, and can we find a clear line separating human from animal? And consistently over the last 12 years, as he's run new analysis after new analysis, as new human fossils show up and potentially ape-men kind of creatures show up, he runs these analyses, and consistently there is a large gap here between what is considered human and what is not human. And that's exciting, because the results don't have to show that. We're just plugging in a bunch of numbers into a computer and having it pop out statistically significant populations of continuity, discontinuity. And that's what we see, is we got really good correlation here for humans being a separate created kind than the other creatures that are out there, which is what we predict as creationists. This kind of chart shows it as well. And this one, you got to think back to the days before Siri and GPS and all that kind of stuff, okay? When you had to use atlases. Do you remember road atlases? Okay, so they had those charts where it'd have like cities, and they'd have cities down here, and it'd be like, okay, how long does it take to drive from Toronto to Quebec City? I don't know why I picked Canadian ones, but, and you'd have to like line them up, and where they match, that would be the mileage, right, between those. And if you had, how long does it take for Toronto to Toronto? I mean, that's dumb, right? So it'd be 0 or it'd be a black spot or something. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Imagine all these names down here on the bottom too. And so Homo rudolfensis positively correlates with Homo rudolfensis. Yes, because it's the same thing. But Homo rudolfensis also positively correlates with Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Erectus, all these kinds of things. But none of them show any positive correlation to any of the Australopithecines or chimpanzees or gorillas. So what we can see there is a definite separate humankind. Now, one of the discoveries that came through this, which was very shocking for a lot of people, was that the humankind used to be more diverse. We think it's a lot of diversity today if we talk about skin color, hair color, height, weight, things like that. But we used to have people that had, large brow ridges or not very big foreheads. There was larger morphological diversity. And what's really interesting is this creationist perspective seems to be continually getting confirmed by new discoveries. For instance, let's talk about 5 skulls found in a cave in Georgia. Not Georgia the state, Georgia the country, okay? Not gonna get sweet tea over here, okay? In this cave, they found 5 hominin skulls. And they all look very different from one another. This guy, skull 5, he's got a super pulled out kind of muzzle, very low kind of skull like that. Skull 3 here, it's almost a flat face. Skull 4 has no teeth because it's an elderly individual, which means that these creatures were taking care of the elderly, which is, very human kind of trait. And so the scientists who found this were puzzled. What do we do? Because they said, if these skulls were found in different places around the world, we would assign each one its own species. But here they are in the same cave altogether. And by the way, that cave is not incredibly far away from the Ark, okay? Where it would have landed, mountains of Ararat. And so the scientists who worked on this, they said, well, they've got to all be Homo erectus, but we don't know why. We don't know how to explain that. I mean, they look so different from each other. But if we're thinking as creationists and we're saying, yeah, there used to be greater diversity when people first got off the Ark, as well as the other animals, and they started repopulating the Earth, we saw this big boom in diversity. And that's what we're seeing here, is these different forms, and then over time, different populations of people either went extinct, died out, or intermarried to the point that those kinds of things disappeared. So for instance, probably almost everyone in this room has Neanderthal DNA. And that's, if you have European or Asian ancestry at all, you have Neanderthal ancestry. Neanderthals were intermarrying with Homo sapiens, and we know that. And then there's also examples of another people group called Denisovans that were also intermarrying. And then they've discovered that Melanesian people have a third group that's out there that we don't even know who they are. I'm holding out for Homo erectus. I think that's what it is. But they were all intermarrying with each other. They're all humans. And so this is really cool because we can explain this from a biblical perspective, whereas the evolutionists are out there kind of scratching their heads and they're like, we don't know why this is happening. We expect these very separate species to be appearing at different times and everything, and it's just a big confusing bush. And we're like, yes, because that's what we'd predict as creationists. That's what we would expect to see. And so let me wrap up things here. What are some takeaways? Once again, if you fell asleep, here we go. Studying fossils gives us a greater understanding of Noah's flood and its aftermath. Once again, the text is clear. We don't need science to, we're not altering the text by science, right? We're not doing what Linnaeus did. We want the text to speak because it's the revelation of God. But there are many, many details the text doesn't get into, and that's where science, we can step in and say, hey, let's figure out what's going on here with these different creatures. And many things that initially seem to be challenges actually result in amazing discoveries with time and effort. This is one of the great stories of creation science, is that there's these things that you're like, man, I don't know what to do about that. That seems like an insurmountable challenge. And sometimes people give up. And they're like, no, that's it. I can't be a creationist because of X, Y, and Z. And if you're just patient and we have hard work, many times in a few years to decades, we start to see some really exciting things happening. And in some areas, we start to be able to explain the science better than the evolutionary community, which is thrilling, right? Because we know ultimately our worldview is true. And so we can step out in confidence, which is actually my last point there. Go out and make discoveries. Be confident. Don't be like, oh, I don't know, I'm scared. What if I find a transitional form? No, go out there and discover something because you know God is telling you the truth. You have nothing to fear. And I went out of order here. Let me do my third one. Our preconceptions can get in the way of understanding Scripture and nature correctly. This is a really important one. Linnaeus came at the text and came at science with some preconceived notions. We can do the same thing. We do it all the time. And so constantly going back to Scripture and having Scripture challenge what you say and think. Constantly going to other people, right? Talking to other people in different fields and people you trust and saying, what do you think about this? Be humble. Be willing to admit, yeah, maybe I'm wrong about something. That's okay. That's a good thing. That's how we should make discoveries. Let me close with this. Yesterday, I shared with you that I'm at the Master's University, and I talked about we have science degree programs. We're looking for more science students. If you know someone who wants to study biology or geology or environmental science, they should come out here. And plus, it's California, so we have good weather and all that kind of fun stuff. But also want to share with you, we have this opportunity, if people are interested, if we're going down to the Grand Canyon. And we're not going to hike all the way down to the bottom. Okay, we are going to hike in it. And we're going to see some really cool geology, some amazing things, and the Coconino sandstone and some of the other rock layers out there. And so I get to be the guide for that. And we're looking specifically for high school student families, but we're taking younger families too. If you're like, hey, I want my kids to have this experience of seeing the Grand Canyon from a biblical creationist perspective, man, this is your opportunity. So I want to promote that. I've got all kinds of promotional materials out on the table out there. I'll be out there. I've also got a little Tiktaalik 3D print skull that I can talk to you about because it's a cool animal. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Mclain. I think we have a few minutes if there are any questions that folks would like to ask our speaker. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
We got one down here. Let me pass the mic down to you.
What would be your definition of death following Adam's fall?
Could you? Oh, sure. Mic for the live stream.
What would be your definition of death that followed Adam's fall?
Okay. So death. Here's the fun thing. What you'll discover about science is the most basic concepts we don't have good definitions for. What is energy? Ask anyone. That's a hard one. What is life and what is death? Also really difficult. So what I would say is this. Clearly humans were not dying before Adam's fall. And I think as Gordon Wilson talked about in the last talk, when we're seeing animals, right, things we recognize instantly as animals, those are not dying, right? Now plants, I don't think you see any biblical reason why a plant couldn't die. They don't seem to they don't have the breath of life in their nostrils as it talks about, the nephesh life. In the same way, what about microscopic organisms? I don't think they're in view of the text. So I think we have the freedom to kind of explore that. For instance, your body's made of cells, right? Are cells alive? Biologically, yes. Yet for you to have fingernails and skin cells and hair, there must be dead cells, right? You can't have those things without dead cells. Is that biblical death? No, I don't think it is. I don't think that that will be considered a living creature in the way the Bible talks about it. But I know we're going to talk more about this in the Q&A. So, and plus, I'm not the biblical expert, nor am I the biological expert. So I'll let some of them speak into that in the Q&A.